Hello there. I hope you're all well. Apologies for the long absence. My job situation had radically changed over the last few months and getting that in order took some time. I should be able to more consistently release videos now. My thoughts are with everyone in Ukraine at the moment. If you can, please donate to charities that are aimed at keeping people safe, providing food and vital resources, or getting people out of the country. We might not be able to stop Russian aggression, but we may be able to do our small part for someone in desperate need at this time. On with the video. Over the last few weeks, I've heard a lot about the UN doing something, anything, to stop this barbarism in Ukraine, with many people believing a vote in the General Assembly would and should do the trick, or maybe even the Security Council. Now, the obvious answer to the title question is because the UN Security Council has a veto for the Permanent Five, and Russia is a member of the Permanent Five. Oh, yep. In a nutshell, the UN can't do anything because the council relevant to intervening has a member with a veto who is the aggressor in this situation. That's the simple part of it, but of course there's a lot more to it, as ever with international politics. Our current state system is a Westphalian system. I'm thinking about doing a deeper look at this, but in the meantime I will just summarise here. The Westphalian system is named after the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which ended the 30 Years' War. It was one of the most destructive wars in European history, with some places losing almost half their entire population. One of the main issues in the war, beyond the greater dynastic contest between the Habsburgs and the Bourbons, was who had the right to interfere within an independent state. Essentially, the Peace of Westphalia established that each state was sovereign within its own borders. That is, the government that controlled a territorial entity could do as they pleased within that state. This is enshrined in the United Nations Charter, which states in Article 7 that
nothing contained in the present Charter shall authorise the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within domestic jurisdiction of any state, or shall require the members to submit such matters to settlement under the present Charter. But this principle shall not prejudice the application of enforcement measures under Chapter 7.
That is a lot of words to say that nobody is allowed to interfere within another state's borders. For example, the United Kingdom can't just roll up to France and start imposing laws or duties upon French citizens. The US can't just roll up to Timbuktu and start imposing rules. That, in theory, is absolute. Obviously, there are caveats, exceptions, and excuses. This issue is at the heart of much of the disagreements over international relations at this time, and truly has been for quite some time. The definition of what is and what is not permissible changed rapidly after the Second World War. Prior to that, governments could and often did dispose of people as they pleased within their own borders. You only need to look at how my country, the United Kingdom, treated Irish people or colonial populations, same with Belgium in the Congo, France in Vietnam, and so on. After the Second World War and the horrors of the Holocaust, the conception of what was and was not acceptable within domestic competence started to change, as did the concept of rights. We now speak of human rights, universal to every person on the planet, and some of the regimes on the planet vehemently deny that such rights exist, as they aren't compatible with their culture or their society. Under the strictest interpretation of the Westphalian Order, no country can act to impose those rights on another nation. It's why China considers it such a grievous offence for people to speak of Taiwan or provide support for those that live there, because the Chinese government sticks very closely to their belief in the Westphalian system, so long as it serves their interests. And in their view, Taiwan is a Chinese province, not an independent country. Within this, you have the two broad theories of international relations, liberalism and realism. These are not domestic political tags, so don't have the same connotations. Liberals, in IR theory, want to create international organisations that are above the state in order to better harmonise the relations between states. The idea being that these organisations cut down on armed conflict and lead to more negotiations and better negotiations. Realists hold that the sole actor on the world stage can only ever be the state. International organisations can have roles, but they are limited and always subservient to the state. Realism also holds that no state can ever truly rely on another state, no matter what charters or treaties signed, organisations party to, or any other form of mutual aid. A state when under attack can only ever depend upon themselves. These two theories are used to explain international relations from today all the way back to time immemorial. Over the past 100 or so years, we've been increasingly of a liberal bend, following Woodrow Wilson's reorientation of the global order, first with the failed League of Nations and then the United Nations. It's an attempt to draw the world closer together, and in some aspects it has worked, because there are less conflicts now, and the UN is a big part of that. But it is important to understand the UN, whilst filled with eternal optimists, is severely restricted in what it can do. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the aim was to set up an international organisation which would have more teeth than the now defunct League of Nations and would be a better way of preserving global peace. Despite what was going on, nobody wanted another war. Part of the negotiations were aimed at creating the United Nations Security Council, where the great powers could determine issues of security and work together at resolving them. It was decided that the 5 great powers would have a permanent seat at the Security Council, each of them the victors of World War II. They were the United States, the United Kingdom, the French Republic, the Soviet Union, and the Republic of China. The Republic of China lost the Chinese Civil War, and eventually the seat was turned over to the People's Republic of China, despite Taiwan, the last holdout of the ROC, claiming de jure rights over China. The remaining 10 members are rotated around the ordinary members of the United Nations. The most contentious issue is the veto. Each of the permanent 5 have a veto over any substantive resolution, regardless of the voting number. This means that whilst any topic can be discussed at the Security Council, any resolution that proposes an action can be prevented from ever being enacted. A vote against by a P5 member is considered a veto, whilst an abstention can allow the vote to pass. China has been stringent about ensuring sovereignty is not encroached upon, partly because of its own beliefs and partly because it suits the Chinese government to not allow meddling in disputed territories within its own state. Russia, like the United States, goes by its own strategic interests. One of the most contentious vetoes of late is the vote on Draft Resolution S 2018-321. They really do have the most engaging resolution naming system, which was aimed at recognising the use of chemical weapons in Syria. The Syrian regime, a solidly Russian ally, and prior to the annexation of Crimea, the site of its largest warm water naval base, was being protected by the Russian government. This is not unique to Russia or China. The United States will regularly veto any resolution that aims at condemning Israel for actions taken in the occupied territories of Palestine, or reaching back, the United States, UK and France all voted against condemning apartheid. Originally, there were proposals to prevent a power from vetoing a resolution that is aimed at its own actions, but that was abandoned during the negotiation stage. So now you can clearly see why the United Nations can't do anything, because the setup of the UN is that the P5 all have a veto, and any resolution will be vetoed by Russia. We're using very, very careful language about what they are doing. There's been several moves, one to recognise the separatists in Donbass as a legitimate breakaway movement, and one to accuse Nazis of becoming active in Ukraine and perpetrating a genocide against ethnic Russians in the Donbass region. This is the pretext, the casus belli, for which Russia has invaded Ukraine, and they've been very, very careful to stick to these lines in an attempt to establish the legal justification for what essentially amounts to a war of aggression and presumably annexation. Lastly, just briefly, I want to touch on this myth being spread around the internet and even finding its way into the mouths of elected politicians. This was not caused by NATO. NATO is a defensive military alliance. They're not brilliant, and they are certainly not without ethical issues. But ask yourself, why would your neighbours feel threatened to the point of joining a military alliance headed by a country nobody likes or really even trusts? The only reason that NATO has expanded, so to speak, is because Russia's neighbours over the past 2 decades have been feeling increasingly threatened by Russia's aggressive actions. Russia's irredentism over territories the Soviet Union used to control is what is driving this conflict. So let's put that myth to bed. This isn't the first war in Europe since the end of the Second World War, or even the Cold War. It's not even the first mass attack against civilians. though it seems to have been airbrushed out of history, or even more disgustingly, used as a reason for why NATO is evil. The conflict around the dissolution of Yugoslavia and the genocide that occurred there, primarily against Bosnians, happened in the 1990s. We should not forget that in our rush to state just how outrageous this attack on Ukraine is. Nor should we resort to some of the language we've seen in the media outlets, such as saying it's unprecedented because this is Europe and not the Middle East, as if that sort of racism is somehow okay. We should be taking a solid stand against aggressive armed conflict wherever possible, wherever it happens, not just in Europe, and not just because the victims of this one happen to be white. I urge everyone listening to do what they can, whether it is to pressure your national government to open up borders for refugees or to send military aid, or you yourself donating to charities or other organisations aimed at helping the Ukrainian people. I hope you found this informative. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.